Dead America. Tales of the First Month. The Highway. By Derek Slayton. Chapter 1. Day 0, 11:57 p.m. Julia lay in her bed, her gaze fixed on the ceiling, much like it had been for the past hour and a half. Sleep proved elusive for the bartender, accustomed to the bustling nightlife along San Antonio's Riverwalk, where she would typically be serving drinks to tourists at this hour. Tonight, however, she grappled with the challenge of behaving like a regular person, attempting to find rest while the sun remained hidden beneath the horizon. Note to self, Julia muttered to the quiet room. If anybody on day shift ever asks to switch shifts again, you just tell them no. A heavy sigh escaped her lips as she glanced over at the clock, its hands creeping steadily toward midnight. Maybe if I drank more it would help. She pondered aloud, shaking her head in dismissal. No, Julia, you can't do that. Because if you have one, then you'll have 6, then it'll be 5 in the morning and you'll get 3 hours sleep to work a double tomorrow. And if you think you hate life now. With a resigned exhale, Julia decided to abandon the futile pursuit of sleep and hoisted herself out of bed. If I'm going to be awake, I might as well enjoy myself, she reasoned. See if there's a movie on or something. Julia strolled into the living room of her compact apartment, only to be interrupted by the sound of raised voices outside. This wasn't an uncommon event in her neighborhood. Despite earning a decent income, she preferred not to squander it on an overpriced apartment that she'd rarely see due to her work schedule. The trade-off, however, was occasional disturbances in the parking lot. Disregarding the commotion, she made her way to the couch, sinking into its comfort and reaching for the remote. With a flick of her wrist, she powered on the television and snuggled under a cozy blanket. As she settled in, she began scrolling through channels in search of entertainment. It took a few clicks before she stumbled upon an old sitcom. Score. Julia exclaimed with a grin, delighted to have found something to occupy her restless mind. Julia tossed the remote onto the table beside her, eyes catching sight of a half-eaten bag of chips. Without hesitation, she snatched it up, delving into its crunchy contents. As she munched away, the continued screams from outside failed to disrupt her focus. Suddenly, the cacophony escalated, reaching a fever pitch that made Julia's skin prickle. It sounded like someone was pleading for their life. She briefly entertained the idea of intervening before swiftly dismissing it. No, Julia, she reminded herself sternly. Remember what happened to Becky's roommate when she tried to get involved in the neighbor's drama. You're not going to get many tips missing your front teeth. Refocusing on the sitcom, Julia's attention was drawn to the faint blue lights filtering through the blinds. Well, apparently someone in the complex was feeling helpful, she mused dryly. Happy to let the situation outside resolve itself, Julia returned her focus to the television. However, her concentration was shattered by the jarring sound of gunshots echoing from the parking lot. Jesus Christ, she exclaimed, instinctively dropping to the floor for cover as the shots rang out in rapid succession. Just as suddenly as it began, the gunfire ceased, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Then, a voice shattered the quiet. I need help. Please, I need help. Reluctant but compelled by the continued pleas for help, Julia pulled herself to her feet, slipping on a pair of shoes before cautiously approaching the window. Please, help me. The voice outside grew more desperate with each cry. Julia peered through the window, momentarily blinded by the flashing blue lights before her vision adjusted. Finally, she spotted an officer on the ground, clutching his leg in agony. Beside him lay a motionless figure, and even from her vantage point, she could see a spray of blood each time the officer moved his hand away from his wound. Oh my God. Julia gasped, her heart racing with a mix of fear and concern. With a sense of urgency, she dashed to the coat closet, flinging it open and grabbing a towel from the stack at the bottom before bolting out the door. As she approached the injured officer, he heard her footsteps and swiveled, his handgun trained on her. Don't shoot. Don't shoot. Julia cried out, raising her hands in surrender as the towel fell to the ground. It took a moment for the frightened officer to register that Julia was there to assist, prompting him to lower his weapon. Please, I'm bleeding badly, he pleaded. Julia swiftly retrieved the fallen towel and rushed to his side, kneeling beside him as he lifted his hand, revealing a deep, gruesome wound that resembled an animal attack. "What the hell happened to you?" she exclaimed in shock. "This asshole right here ran up and took a chunk out of my leg," the officer gritted through clenched teeth. Julia's eyes widened in disbelief as she looked over to the lifeless body on the ground, noticing the gruesome absence of the back of its head. What perplexed her more was the absence of any visible weapon. "With what?" she questioned. The officer grimaced, his voice strained, his teeth. As Julia continued to apply pressure to the wound, her mind reeled with incredulity. "He bit you?" "Yeah, there's some virus going around that's turning people crazy. And they like to bite," the officer explained through gritted teeth. Relinquishing her hold on the wound, Julia leaned back, her expression a mix of skepticism and apprehension. "Okay, I don't know what your game is, if you're making some sort of prank video with your buddies. But I'm out," she declared, skepticism lacing her tone. The officer's response was immediate and vehement. "This isn't a joke, lady. Look at my fucking leg. That's not a special effect. Go look at him if you don't believe me." With a resigned sigh, Julia reluctantly took a few steps closer to the dead man lying on the ground. Recognition dawned on her as she gasped. "That's Mr. Harper. You shot Mr. Harper in the head." The officer's voice was grim as he responded, "After he took a chunk out of my leg." Julia felt panic bubbling up inside her as she looked down at her neighbor, now transformed into a ghastly figure missing the back of his head. Before she could fully process the horrifying sight, a moan from across the street snapped her attention away. Both she and the officer turned to see another zombie sprinting towards them. Julia stood frozen, her mind unable to comprehend the surreal scene unfolding before her. In contrast, the officer reacted swiftly, raising his gun and taking aim. He fired a few shots in rapid succession. The first struck the creature in the chest, but it continued its relentless charge. The second shot missed its mark entirely, but the third found its target, piercing the center of the ghoul's forehead. With a final stumble, the creature collapsed to the ground. Julia remained rooted to the spot, her gaze fixed on the fallen creature, unable to find words to articulate the horror coursing through her veins. "This is happening everywhere in the city," the officer stated grimly, breaking the eerie silence. "If you can help me up, I'm getting in my car and getting the hell out of here. I'd recommend you do the same." Julia nodded in acknowledgement before rushing to assist the officer to his feet. With a steadying hand, she helped him towards his car, their progress halted by the ominous sound of approaching moans and frenzied footsteps. "Get back inside. Now," the officer commanded urgently as they heard the unsettling sounds drawing nearer. Julia hurriedly guided the officer a few more steps until he was pressed against the back of his car. Then she turned and sprinted back towards the safety of her apartment. Gunshots echoed behind her, but she didn't dare look back. As she reached the door, she glanced over her shoulder, witnessing the chaotic scene unfolding. 3 of the creatures charged at the officer as he emptied his magazine into them. One fell to a precise headshot, but the other 2 collided with the officer, bringing him crashing to the ground. A gut-wrenching scream tore through the air as the zombies sank their teeth into his flesh, tearing at him mercilessly. For a moment, Julia stood transfixed by the horrifying spectacle before her survival instincts kicked in. She darted to the table beside the couch, snatching up her phone and keys before bolting back out the door, determined to escape the nightmare unfolding outside. Julia sprinted towards her car parked just outside her apartment door, her heart pounding in her chest. As she fumbled for her keys and hit the unlock button, the distinct sound alerted one of the zombies near the officer to her presence. Immediately, it abandoned its gruesome feast and charged towards her with alarming speed. Julia barely managed to dive into the driver's side door, slamming it shut just seconds before the ghoul reached her. The zombie pounded its bloody fists against the window, its frenzied attempts to break the glass sending shivers down Julia's spine. But the reinforced glass held firm against the onslaught. Ignoring the terror pounding in her ears, Julia started the car and threw it into reverse, the vehicle lurching backward with a jolt. She rolled past the police car and onto the street, the sudden impact of the curb sending her bouncing violently in her seat. As Julia glanced back at the officer she had attempted to assist, a surge of horror and disbelief washed over her. He lay motionless on the ground, the ghoul atop him mercilessly tearing into his flesh. "What the hell is going on?" she muttered to herself. With a heavy heart and a sense of urgency, Julia slammed her foot on the gas pedal, propelling the car down the street. In a desperate attempt to make sense of the chaos engulfing her world, she reached for the radio and switched it to the news station. To her dismay, all that greeted her ears was music. Ordinarily, this wouldn't have been cause for alarm at this hour, but tonight was different. Where the hell is the news? Julia muttered under her breath, frustration and fear mounting with each passing moment. Julia's heart raced as she glanced down at the radio, her fingers hovering over the scan button in a futile attempt to find some semblance of information or reassurance. Before she could press it, a sudden thud against the side of her car jolted her back to the present. Startled, she peered into the rearview mirror just in time to see one of the creatures rebounding from the impact and scrambling to its feet, its eyes fixed hungrily on her car. Refusing to succumb to panic, Julia continued driving down the neighborhood street, her destination uncertain. A couple of blocks ahead, she encountered a red light and braked to a stop, unwilling to risk speeding through and risking a collision. Her gaze wandered across the street to a gas station where two cars sat parked by the pumps. But it was the sight of a pair of twitching legs protruding from behind one of the cars that caught her attention. Before she could fully comprehend the scene, a ghoul emerged from near the front of the store, lunging at the helpless figure and sinking its teeth into their flesh. Julia's heart raced as she tried to gather her wits, her thoughts a jumble of fear and uncertainty. Her nerves were already frayed when a sudden impact against the passenger side window elicited a startled scream from her lips. Instinctively, she began to hit the gas, ready to flee, but hesitated when a voice called out, "Please help." Julia's gaze snapped towards the source of the voice and locked onto a man in his early 30s, his appearance ordinary save for the smear of blood on his glasses. "Please let me in. They're right behind me." The man pleaded urgently, his eyes wide with fear. Julia's heart went out to him as she followed his gaze and spotted 3 zombies sprinting towards him. Without a moment's hesitation, she pressed the unlock button on the car. In a swift motion, the man flung open the door and leaped inside, slamming it shut just as the creatures reached them. Julia hit the gas pedal, propelling the car across the intersection, her eyes fixed on a sign for Highway 281. "Thank you so much. Thank you. I'd be dead if you didn't let me in," the man exhaled, relief evident in his voice. Julia remained silent, her focus fixed on the road ahead as Elliot spoke up. "I'm Elliot," he said, offering his name in gratitude. "Julia," she replied tersely, her attention on the road unwavering. "Thank you, Julia," Elliot acknowledged. He hesitated for a moment before reaching for the radio, which was emitting music. Julia instinctively smacked his hand away before offering an apologetic gesture. "Sorry, reflexes. My ex would always change my radio station, even if I was singing along. Please, try and find us some news," she said. "Will do. But do you have any idea where we're going?" Elliot inquired, glancing around uncertainly. "A police officer told me that I should get out of town. So that's exactly what I'm going to do," Julia replied resolutely, her grip firm on the steering wheel. Elliot nodded as he observed the sign indicating the turnoff for the highway. He began scanning the radio stations, searching for any shred of information, still finding nothing but music. Chapter 2. As Julia accelerated down the on-ramp towards the highway, the distant glow of taillights from other fleeing vehicles offered a calming sense of normality. Reaching their cruising speed on the highway, Julia began to relax slightly, relieved to be on the road to safety. However, her moment of respite was interrupted by Elliot's frustration with the lack of news on the radio. "I don't understand. Why is there no news about what's going on?" Elliot questioned. Julia glanced over at him, understanding his frustration all too well. It's after midnight in the middle of the week. Those stations are on skeleton crews. If they even have anybody there at all, they could be all automated at this point. Elliot nodded in acknowledgement. "Yeah, that's true. Or national. Why pay 100 people to operate the stations in big cities when you can underpay one person in the middle of Iowa to hit some buttons on a computer? Julia returned her attention to the road, her focus unwavering, while Elliot remained seated, momentarily absorbed by the blood staining his glasses. Carefully removing them, he gazed at the crimson smears. "I have some napkins in the glove box there." "Probably not the best for the lenses, though," Julia offered. Elliot glanced at her before responding. "Can't be any worse than the blood." "Is that?" Julia's voice faltered, her uncertainty palpable as she trailed off, leaving her sentence unfinished. Elliot sensed her hesitation, preemptively understanding her unspoken question. "Don't worry, it's not my blood," he reassured her. Relieved, Julia nodded. "That's good." "Yeah, I don't even know whose blood it is," Elliot added, his brow furrowing in thought as he wiped the blood from his glasses. After thinking for a moment, Elliot recounted, "I was at the bus stop with a couple of other people. I didn't really pay them any attention, just engrossed in my book and not really caring to start a conversation. Next thing I know, one of them is screaming as one of those people, or things, or whatever they are, was biting into her." His words hung in the air, the memory weighing heavily upon him. He hesitated before continuing. "I turned just in time to see it. The top part of her arm just ripped out, her blood splashing onto me. The rest was a blur, just..." It took Elliot a moment to compose himself, his mind reeling as he processed the harrowing scene he had just witnessed. "It was just noise and a lot of movement," Elliot recounted, his voice strained with the weight of the memory. "Her friend yelling and punching the guy who attacked her. I knew I should help, I wanted to help, but I just couldn't. My body wouldn't let me. By the time I got to my feet, I heard more footsteps coming up from behind them. I looked over and saw 4 more of those things running towards the fray. So I ran. The next thing I know, I'm banging on your window and we're on the road towards Dallas." Julia listened intently, her empathy evident as she replied, "You didn't do anything wrong, Elliot. I went out to help a cop who got bitten, and I ran away too. Whatever this is, whatever is happening, it's way above our pay grade. I'm a bartender, for Christ's sake. So, unless the problem is fixed by pouring a drink, I'm not much help." Elliot nodded solemnly. "I'm a research assistant at a law firm, so unless the problem can be solved by digging through books older than my grandfather, I'm not much help either." They shared a moment of understanding, their shared trauma binding them together in a strange camaraderie. A sudden, hysterical laughter bubbled up from within them, a release valve for the overwhelming fear and tension they carried. For several moments, they laughed uncontrollably, the sound echoing in the confines of the car as they traversed the dark road. Then, as they rounded a turn, Elliot's laughter abruptly ceased. "Brakes. Brakes," he shouted. Julia's reflexes were swift as she rounded the corner, but the sight of the stopped cars ahead left her with little room to maneuver. Despite her best efforts, she couldn't prevent the inevitable collision. The impact sent both occupants lurching forward, their seat belts halting their movement while airbags deployed with a deafening thud. Stunned, they sat in silence for a moment, the gravity of the situation sinking in, before being jolted once again as the car behind them crashed into their rear. Bracing themselves, they awaited further chaos, the cacophony of screeching tires and blaring horns filling the air, followed by the sickening sound of metal colliding. "Are you okay?" Elliot said. It took Julia a moment to collect herself, her hand instinctively reaching to soothe the throbbing pain in her head. With a strained voice, she managed to respond, "Yeah, I'm okay. Are you?" Elliot inspected his broken glasses before dropping them into his lap. "I'll live. But I don't think my glasses are going to make it." Julia suggested, "There should be some tape in the glove box." Elliot chuckled as he rummaged through the compartment. "Is there anything you don't have in there?" "A gun, unfortunately," Julia remarked. Elliot's tone turned cautious. "Be careful about saying that out loud. If the wrong person hears you, they'll strip you of your Texas citizenship." Julia raised an eyebrow. "Did you read that in one of your law books?" Elliot shrugged. "There's all sorts of crazy stuff in there." Elliot couldn't help but let out a strained laugh, wincing as pain shot through his side. With a sense of relief, he finally located the tape, devoting the next few moments to piecing his glasses back together as best as he could manage. "There we go, good as new," he declared, sliding the patched-up glasses back onto his face. Their brief moment of normalcy was shattered as someone darted past their car, catching them off guard. Before they could fully comprehend the situation, several more figures rushed by, some screaming in panic. "What the hell are they doing?" Julia exclaimed. Her question was swiftly answered as a man sprinted toward the front of their car, only to be tackled from behind by a zombie. They watched in horror as the two figures crashed onto the damaged hood, the man's agonized screams piercing the air as flesh was torn from his shoulder. Helpless, Julia and Elliot could only watch as more creatures descended upon the fallen man, indulging in their gruesome feast. "Well, that explains why they were running," Elliot remarked grimly. Julia's response was tinged with resignation. "It's a little too late for us to do the same, though." They both struggled to maintain their composure, their gaze fixed on the nightmarish scene unfolding outside their car. Among the chaos, a young woman now transformed into a zombie, roughly Julia's age, paused beside her window, locking eyes with her before pounding on the glass in a futile attempt to gain entry. After a tense moment, the ghoul's attention was diverted as more creatures joined the fray, allowing Julia and Elliot a brief respite. However, their relief was short-lived as more ghouls emerged from the darkness, their numbers seemingly endless. Where are all these things coming from? Julia wondered aloud. The two of them peered out of the car, their eyes scanning the wreckage in the road. About 30 yards ahead, a bridge spanned the highway over the river, with a cluster of lights illuminating the area on the right-hand side. Elliot nodded solemnly, exhaling heavily. "The new supercenter is up there. Biggest one in town, and it just opened up last week. The place was probably packed when this hit." Julia frowned. "At midnight?" Elliot explained, "Lots of restaurants in the area. Kitchens closing down, and people need to shop." They sat in silence, observing the ever-increasing tide of zombies flooding the road. The ghouls darted between cars, their senses heightened as they sought out any sign of movement. Fear gripped them both, rendering them speechless. Finally, Julia spoke up, breaking the oppressive silence. "I honestly have no idea what to do," Julia admitted. "We could try calling the police," Elliot suggested. Julia shook her head. "You're more than welcome to try, but I don't think it will do any good. Because from the sounds of it, they already know bad things are going down." Elliot dialed 911, only to be met with a busy signal. Frustration etched across his face. He glanced up at the road ahead, his gaze falling upon another pack of zombies running between the wreckage. With a resigned sigh, he dropped the phone into his lap. "So much for that," he muttered. Julia suggested, "Do you have anybody you can call? Give them a heads up about what's happening." Elliot shook his head. "No. My parents live on the other side of the country, and I work far too many hours to have a social life." "What about your coworkers?" Julia inquired. "After the hell they constantly put me through, I really don't want to help them out." Elliot replied with a wry smile. Julia chuckled in understanding. "What about you?" Elliot asked. "The only friends I have are my coworkers, and they're all down at the Riverwalk. They probably knew about this before we did," Julia explained. Elliot and Julia remained seated, subdued by the overwhelming horror unfolding around them. The weight of the situation bore down on them, and it seemed as though they had resigned themselves to their grim fates, accepting that they wouldn't make it out alive. Outside, the chaos escalated as they watched a creature, mere yards ahead, shatter the back window of a car and begin to crawl inside. Despite the driver's frantic attempts to fend it off with punches, the beast pressed on, undeterred by the feeble resistance. In a panic, the driver abandoned his vehicle, fleeing down the highway in a desperate bid for survival. But his efforts were in vain as several ghouls closed in on him, their relentless pursuit driving him to seek refuge atop a nearby car. However, one of the zombies seized his leg, keeping him on the trunk of the vehicle. Even as the ghouls tore into his flesh, the driver stubbornly attempted to crawl atop the car, his resolve unyielding but ultimately futile. Julia and Elliot could only watch in silent horror. their heads shaking in disbelief. There was little else they could do but bear witness to the gruesome spectacle unfolding before them. Elliot glanced down at his phone, contemplating another attempt to call the police, but Julia's gaze remained fixed on the nightmarish scene outside. Julia observed the struggle between the ghouls and the man, noticing that the creatures remained on the ground, each grasping his arms and pulling him. They tugged from both sides of the car, locked in a macabre tug of war, neither side gaining the upper hand. "Look at that," Julia remarked. Elliot hesitated. "If it's all the same to you, I'd rather not. I don't really have the stomach for this kind of violence." "Forget the violence. Just look," Julia insisted. Reluctantly, Elliot tore his gaze away from the gruesome scene and glanced at the ghouls engaged in their struggle. "Yeah, that's horrific. What about it?" he asked, puzzled. "They're not getting up onto the car," Julia pointed out. "So?" Elliot replied, still perplexed. "Look around. Do you see any of them on the cars?" Julia prompted. Elliot and Julia both scanned their surroundings, searching for any ghouls perched atop the vehicles. After several moments of observation, they came up empty-handed. "Okay, so they're not going up on the cars. How does that help us?" Elliot inquired. Julia reached up, pulling back a shade to reveal a sunroof. "We can get up top," she suggested. Elliot frowned. "And go where?" Julia shrugged before gesturing towards the bridge in the distance. "If we can get to the bridge, maybe we can jump down into the water and get away," she suggested. Elliot considered her proposal. "Yeah, maybe. But then what?" "I don't know, man. Maybe live to see the sun come up and take it from there?" Julia offered. "Or we can just sit here and wait for those things to break into the car." After a moment of contemplation, Elliot nodded in agreement. "Okay, let's go for it." Chapter 3. Elliot and Julia sat in the car, steeling themselves for the daunting task ahead. They surveyed the wreckage surrounding them, strategizing their path over the tops of the cars. "I think if we can get over to the SUV beside us, that should give us enough height to jump over to the next one. After that, it's anybody's guess because I can't see past it," Julia proposed. Elliot considered their options. "Do you have anything in here to help fight those things off?" Julia rummaged through the back seat floorboard, eventually pulling out a crowbar, which raised Elliot's eyebrows in surprise. "Why in the world do you have one of those in your back seat?" he asked incredulously. "Do you work downtown until the early hours of the morning?" Julia retorted. "No, can't say that I do," Elliot replied. "Well, my friends and I do, and sometimes you need a little help with the people down there," Julia explained matter-of-factly. "Fair enough. Not complaining," Elliot conceded. "Okay, are you ready to do this?" Julia asked, her tone resolute. "As ready as I'm ever going to be," Elliot replied. Julia nodded, determined to seize their chance for escape. She reached up and pressed the button for the sunroof, surprised and relieved to find that the battery was still operational despite the damage to the car's front end from the wreck. The sunroof creaked open slowly, emitting a shrill sound as the old mechanisms ground against each other. The noise drew the attention of several nearby creatures, who sprinted over and began pounding on the sides of the car. "If we're going to go, we better go now," Elliot urged. Julia nodded, quickly getting into position. She climbed onto the driver's seat and emerged through the sunroof, recoiling as she saw the outstretched hands of the zombies reaching for her, relieved that they couldn't reach her. To be safe, she raised the crowbar in defense, but after a moment she lowered it. It took her a moment to reach the top of the car, where she waited patiently for Elliot to join her. Once they were both atop the car, they surveyed the gap to the SUV just on the other side of the zombies, only a few feet away. Glancing down at the tightly packed creatures below, they exchanged uncertain looks. "I have to admit, that looked like a shorter jump from inside the car," Elliot remarked. "There's no turning back now. We can make the jump," Julia asserted. "I don't know, Julia," Elliot hesitated. "Look at it like this. If you make the jump, you get to keep going. If you miss it, it's only a mistake that you'll have to live with for about 30 seconds, Julia reasoned, trying to bolster their resolve. Elliot hesitated for a moment before reluctantly nodding in agreement. "Do you want to go first?" he asked. "Ladies first, huh? Good to see you're a gentleman," Julia teased, trying to lighten the mood. Elliot considered making a retort, but was too consumed by his fear of making the leap. After a moment of hesitation, Julia accepted the challenge. "Okay, here goes nothing," she muttered, steeling herself for the jump. Julia inched backward as far as she could on the roof of the car, feeling the outstretched fingertips of the ghouls grazing the back of her leg. With a determined huff, she made her move, darting forward and pushing off as hard as she could from the roof. Despite her effort, she only managed to get her chest high enough to land on top of the SUV. Luckily, her foot landed on the shoulder of one of the zombies beside the vehicle, giving her the leverage to push herself up. As she rolled over onto her back on top of the SUV, she found herself breathing short, shallow breaths, panic setting in as she realized how narrowly she had escaped death. "Are you okay?" Elliot called out. It took Julia a moment to calm down enough to nod. "Yeah, I am." "Holy shit, that was close," she admitted breathlessly. Julia rolled over, peering down at the zombie she had inadvertently stepped on, noting its displeased expression. Flipping onto her stomach, she pulled herself forward on the SUV to peer through the front windshield. The driver was in bad shape, unconscious, blood staining his face. Noticing that the airbag hadn't deployed and that he appeared to have struck the steering wheel hard with his head, Julia realized that he was in dire need of medical attention, but she knew it wasn't forthcoming. "I'm sorry, man. I wish I could do something for you," Julia muttered softly, her voice filled with regret. Pulling herself up to one knee by the edge of the roof, she motioned for Elliot to make the jump. "Come on, time's wasting," she urged. Elliot hesitated for a moment before nodding. Stepping back on the roof, he gathered his resolve, wanting to ensure he had enough momentum for the leap. "Here I come," he declared. Elliot made his move, launching himself forward and pushing off as hard as he could from the car's roof. Mid-air, Julia reached out for him, realizing he wouldn't make it on his own. He managed to get high enough that his stomach collided with the side of the vehicle's roof. As Julia grabbed onto his arms and began pulling, Elliot felt the creatures below clawing for his legs, prompting him to thrash about. Kicking as hard as he could to fend them off, he finally flopped onto the SUV's roof, panting heavily, a mixture of panic and exhaustion coursing through him. He glanced down at his legs, relieved to find them uninjured. Julia patted him reassuringly on the chest, offering a comforting gesture. "Come on, we're just getting started," she encouraged. Elliot nodded as Julia helped him to his feet. He started to lean down to check on the driver, but Julia placed a hand on his shoulder to stop him. "It's just going to depress you," she cautioned. "Is he dead?" Elliot inquired. "He might as well be. He needs an ambulance, and he's not going to get one. The only thing he has going for him at the moment is that he's knocked out," Julia replied somberly. Elliot pondered Julia's words for a moment before nodding in agreement. The two of them then turned their attention towards the bridge, plotting their course carefully. They observed the sequence of cars ahead, noting regular vehicles leading up to a pickup truck positioned along the concrete barrier of the bridge. Glancing at the street, they were relieved to see only a relative handful of zombies obstructing their path. "Okay, let's get moving. I'll lead the way, and I don't plan on stopping until I get to that pickup truck. We're going to make a hell of a lot of noise when we land on these cars, and if we stop, we're just going to attract those things," Julia declared. "Okay, I'm with you. But what about the people in the cars?" Elliot asked. "What about them?" Julia responded bluntly. "I mean, shouldn't we try and help them if we can?" Elliot pressed. "You do what you want to, Elliot. But I don't have any medical skills, and I'm hardly in a position to help with anything else," Julia explained. "If they want to do what we're doing, more power to them, and I'll give them a hand if I can. But right now, all I care about is getting away from the highway. And frankly, that should be your only goal too," she added firmly. Elliot thought about it for a moment before nodding in agreement. Even though it went against his helpful nature, he knew that Julia was right. Their odds of survival were already low, and trying to help anybody else would most likely result in their deaths. "Are you ready?" Julia asked, breaking the silence. "Lead the way," Elliot replied. Julia nodded, her determination unwavering as she prepared to lead the way, with Elliot close behind. With a slight nod exchanged between them, they surged forward, running across the tops of the cars. They moved swiftly, their feet pounding on the metal roofs without concern for the noise they generated. As they reached the third car, they halted briefly before pivoting towards the side of the road, preparing to leap to another vehicle. Julia landed safely, but Elliot's jump faltered, leaving him vulnerable to an approaching ghoul. The creature managed to clip his legs, causing him to crash onto the car roof, knocking the wind out of him. Struggling for breath, Elliot attempted to scream but found himself unable to produce any sound. Julia sprang into action, wielding her crowbar with ferocity, striking the ghoul repeatedly until it lay motionless on the ground. Gasping for air, Elliot scrambled to his feet, his panic palpable. Julia met his gaze, her voice steady and reassuring. "Slow breaths. We're okay," she said. Elliot nodded, taking a moment to regulate his breathing. "The truck is next to us, we're going to be okay," Julia reassured him. As they paused for a moment, the sounds of footsteps and moans echoed ominously from the darkness. A gruff man's voice broke through the noise from the side. "You two want to get over to that truck already?" "I'd like to get over there too," the man called out. Looking up, they saw an older man in his 40s, his clothes stained with blood, some of it matted in his beard. They quickly nodded in agreement and leaped over the small gap into the bed of the pickup truck. Turning to watch, they observed the older man make the same perilous journey they had just completed, leaping over the outstretched arms of the creatures. As he landed heavily in the back of the truck, stumbling forward, both Julia and Elliot moved to catch him. Instead of gratitude, he smacked their arms away from him. "Relax, man. We were just making sure you didn't go over the side," Julia reassured him. "I can handle myself," the man retorted gruffly. "I'm Elliot. This is Julia," Elliot said. "I don't give a shit. Just stay out of my way," the man snapped, his tone abrasive. Elliot and Julia exchanged a glance, taking a step back from the irate man. "Okay, my dude, have at it," Julia replied, her tone tinged with sarcasm. The man stared them down for a moment, eyeing the crowbar in Julia's hand. He reached for it, but Julia swiftly raised it into an attack position. "You have enough to deal with without me beating the hell out of you with a crowbar. Now go if you're going to go," she warned, her voice firm. With a grunt, the man relented and turned towards the row of cars leading across the bridge. Julia and Elliot watched as he ran along the tops of the vehicles, unimpeded by zombies thanks to a tractor-trailer pressing against them, pinning the car against the barricade. "He seemed friendly," Elliot remarked wryly. "Now you see why I carry this thing," Julia replied, her grip tightening on the crowbar. They observed the man's progress, expecting to hear a splash as he jumped into the water below. Instead, they were met with a thud followed by pained screams echoing from the depths. "What in the hell?" Julia exclaimed. Both she and Elliot leaned over the side of the truck, peering down to see the man had landed on several large rocks protruding from the shallow water. "Oh my God, there's not enough water for us to jump into," Elliot realized with horror. Stunned into silence, they were jolted back to reality by the sound of footsteps and moans approaching from behind. "What are we going to do?" Elliot whispered. Chapter 4. Julia and Elliot stood in the back of the pickup truck, their hearts heavy as they watched the man below, his broken bones evident from his agonizing screams. The chilling cries echoed through the night air, drawing the attention of everything on the highway. Behind them, the sound of approaching footsteps and moans signaled the arrival of a small horde of zombies drawn to the commotion below. Elliot's swift action pulled Julia down into the truck bed, both of them lying flat, breaths held, as the undead passed by. They listened intently as the zombies hurried past the truck and veered off the road towards the riverbank below. The fading footsteps beside them contrasted sharply with the escalating screams from the injured man, a harrowing symphony of terror. As the immediate threat passed, Julia and Elliot rose to their feet, peering over the edge of the bridge to witness the gruesome scene below. Ghouls surrounded the broken man, feasting on his flesh with grotesque fervor. "We have to get out of here," Julia urged. Elliot hesitated. "And go where? There's not enough water for us to jump into, and those things are down there now." "Then we get to the other side of the bridge and descend," Julia suggested. "We'll just have to hope the water is deep enough to keep those things at bay." Though uncertain, Elliot surveyed their surroundings, taking in the carnage and hearing the moans and movement in the darkness. With a resigned nod, he acquiesced. "Okay, I'm following you." Julia nodded resolutely as she swiftly climbed over the cab of the truck, Elliot close on her heels. Their hearts raced as they picked up the pace, racing over the next dozen cars lined alongside the barrier of the bridge. As they neared the tractor-trailer wedged against the cars, movement on the bridge ahead caught their attention. A massive horde of ghouls had gathered around a van, relentlessly attempting to breach its defenses without success. Julia halted abruptly, her breath catching in her throat as the ghouls loomed just 10 yards away. Ahead, she noted the significant gap between the next car and the hood of the following vehicle. It was a perilous stretch, but their only path forward. Pointing out the distance to Elliot, she saw the defeat in his expression, prompting her to grab his shirt and shake him lightly, urging him to focus. She understood the reality of their situation. Making a run over the exposed road would be risky, but they had no other options. Rather than risk running over the car ahead, she proceeded cautiously, treading as softly as possible to avoid drawing attention from the horde by the van. Yet, as they reached the rooftop of the adjacent car, a misstep caused the metal to groan beneath her weight, the noise piercing the air and alerting a lone creature at the rear of the van. With a guttural moan, it bolted towards them, gaining ground before its companions took notice. Julia and Elliot quickened their pace, sprinting with all their might, leaping from the car onto the road, their strides unsteady as they hurried towards the next vehicle. Julia refused to glance back at the encroaching zombie, her focus fixed solely on their escape route. Elliot, however, watched as the ghoul closed the gap, realizing he wouldn't outpace it. With no other recourse, he edged closer to the bridge's edge, waiting as the zombie closed in. Just as it reached him, he pushed it with all his strength, sending it hurtling over the precipice. Without waiting to see its fate, Elliot dashed to the car, reaching it moments before the other creatures reached him. "Are you okay?" Julia asked breathlessly. "Yeah, I'm good," Elliot replied, his voice strained. "But I'd rather not do that again." The pair glanced back, observing the mass of zombies converging on them from the van. "I don't think you have a choice. Come on," Julia urged. Scrambling to their feet, they dashed over the remaining cars, halting just shy of the bridge's end. Peering out, they discerned the cause of the accident, an overturned tractor-trailer about 50 yards ahead. A line of mangled cars had collided with it, and they could detect movement in the vicinity. Their attention returned to the pursuing ghouls, thwarted by a blockade of wrecked cars spanning the entire highway. "Come on, let's get down to the water," Julia proposed, moving forward. But Elliot's grip on her arm halted her. "What is it?" she inquired. "Look up there, on the side of the road," Elliot directed. She followed his gaze and spotted a police cruiser nearby, its driver's side door ajar and the emergency lights still flashing. "I think it's still running," Elliot remarked. "Yeah, and so are the 30 of those things on the road," Julia retorted. "I doubt it's that many, and besides, they're trapped in the wreckage," Elliot reasoned. "And what if they're not?" Julia countered. "Then at least we took our best shot. We settled on jumping down to the water because that was the only option we had. Now we have something better, something that could really get us out of here," Elliot argued persuasively. Julia molded over before reluctantly nodding. "Yeah, all right, but I'm driving." "Lead the way then," Elliot acquiesced. Julia nodded as they descended from the car, their movements as silent as possible against the pavement. They took care to step softly, minimizing any noise as they traversed the bridge. Upon reaching the bridge's end, they stepped onto the grass, further reducing the sound. Moans and shuffling emanated from the highway beside them as they hastened their pace, making it halfway to the police car before spotting a lone zombie approaching. Instead of fleeing, Julia stood her ground, wielding the crowbar as it drew nearer. It was the only creature in sight, running and moaning, with no others in pursuit. With a swift swing, she struck the creature on the side of the head, sending it careening off the road and into the grass. She remained on alert, anticipating its resurgence, but it lay still. After a moment, they resumed their sprint towards the car. Approaching within 10 yards of the overturned tractor-trailer, they noticed half a dozen zombies nearby, attempting to access a car. What alarmed them more was the narrow path available for pursuit if they were spotted. Julia and Elliot hurried, maintaining utmost quietness. Despite their efforts, Elliot tripped over a rock at the roadside, his foot slamming onto the pavement. "Run," Julia urged sharply. The two of them bolted towards the police car, the horde of zombies surging from behind the truck in pursuit. Despite having a 10-yard lead, the creatures closed in rapidly. As they neared the car, the approaching footsteps sounded ominously close, the vehicle appearing just out of reach. Julia pushed herself, but her hope dwindled with each passing second. Elliot, trailing a few steps behind, shared the sinking feeling. Glancing back, he saw the nearest zombie mere feet away, while the car remained 15 yards distant. Realization dawned on him he wouldn't reach it in time. His legs trembled, unable to match the relentless pace of the undead. Yet, he glimpsed Julia ahead, realizing she still had a chance. "Do it, man," Elliot shouted, his voice strained with determination. With a sudden burst of resolve, he halted, pivoted, and lunged back towards the approaching zombies. Executing a precise tackle, he slammed his shoulder into the nearest creature, driving it backward into the others. A sharp cry escaped him as the horde descended, tearing into his flesh. The commotion caught Julia's attention, prompting her to glance back and realize Elliot was no longer behind her. "Damn it," she cursed. She didn't halt her escape, understanding there was nothing she could do for Elliot now. Reaching the car, she swiftly climbed in, slamming the door shut. It took a moment to orient herself, but she managed to shift the car into drive and press the gas pedal. The police vehicle accelerated rapidly, merging back onto the road, putting distance between her and the horrifying scene behind. A few miles outside the city limits, traffic was sparse, with only a few passing cars in the opposite direction. She briefly considered warning them, but the risk of encountering another officer and facing arrest deterred her. Julia let out a startled scream as the radio crackled to life, the dispatcher's voice breaking the silence. "Car 32, do you copy?" The dispatcher called out. Julia hesitated, considering ignoring the call, but the dispatcher persisted, prompting her to respond. "Hello, can you hear me?" She answered cautiously. "Who is this?" "Identify yourself," the dispatcher demanded. Scanning the interior of the car, Julia spotted the computer screen displaying the designation car 32. "It doesn't matter. I'm in car 32, she replied. "Whoever's car this was is dead and gone. There was a massive wreck on Highway 281. There's a lot of people dead and a lot of those things running around." There's a prolonged silence on the line before the dispatcher responds, their voice heavy with weariness. "Copy that, car 32. On any other night, I'd be telling you how much trouble you're in and how you're going to spend the rest of your life in jail for stealing a police car," the dispatcher acknowledges. "But with what's going on, I don't think it's going to matter by the time the sun comes up," they add somberly. "Is it really that bad out there?" Julia asks, concern evident in her voice. "It's all over the city. Probably Austin too," the dispatcher confirms grimly. "Is there anywhere safe I can go?" Julia inquires desperately. "I don't know, I'm sorry, someplace that doesn't have people," the dispatcher suggests. "Thank you. And I'm sorry about your officers," Julia said. "Good luck to you," the dispatcher responds. "You too," Julia reciprocates before ending the call. Julia sets the receiver down, contemplating her options as she spots a country road turnoff approaching. She slows down, turning on her turn signal and stopping in the road for a moment to consider. Unsure of where the road leads, she knows only that it's off the beaten path and hopefully away from people. Finally, she makes the turn, guiding the police car down the darkened road towards the unknown. The end.